in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices. I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Alan Susi. He is the Director of People at S&P Global. Alan, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Awesome. Hi, thanks everybody. Thanks for having me, Christina. I go by he, him, his, and it's a great first question. I really wanted to be a gym teacher and high school football or basketball or track coach when I was growing up. Little did I know I would be doing somewhat similar things, less athletically, but more managerially.
More managerial, but still in that coach realm, I feel like. That's a great answer. If you fast forward to now, how do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point to be in people, operations, and also specifically at S&P Global?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, I was recently asked the same question and I boiled it down to one word and it's been growth.
Okay.
And that's not unlike a lot of other people, but I think for mine, it was kind of making some deliberate choices after I left college to pick experiences over the immediate value, and also the impact to the group I was working with or the group I'm around, rather than a role or a title or some sort of prestige that might come with the situation I was in, and that has really, I think, gotten me to where I am today.
Absolutely. Growth is really important, having that growth mindset and being open to opportunity. There's been, a lot of changes that are happening. I've seen S&P Global in the news with the merger with IHS Market, which was $44.5 billion in transactions, not a small number.
Not small.
And we discussed how this includes a lot of change management and organizational shifts. How do you prioritize, even where to start when you're building out this combined or cohesive culture from a people perspective?
Great question. The sheer size of the merger is just amazing, and it's something to behold. And $44.5 billion transaction, the largest announced in the year 2020.
Yeah.
Not a normal year, so I think that has added a layer of complexity, and it really does get to the change management and shifting. These kind of mergers don't take place all the time. There's always a large merger, but of this size, we're talking about a combined 36,000 people that are coming together. The leaders of the organization, and I think they're spot on, is this might only happen once in your entire career. You may go through mergers and acquisitions in various sizes of companies, but one this big in a year like this, it's really unique. And I think we've tried to make that a part of how we're going about the merger. So we're being really pragmatic about the changes we take on. What can be done now, we're still pre-closed, so obviously I can't really talk about anything, but we're engaging with our peers on the IHS Market side, and just making sure that we're thoughtful about what we can do pre-close, what we can do post-close, meeting our targets, meeting what we've talked to the street about, but really making sure that we set some clear principles about how we engage folks, what we're trying to get to, right? So really being thoughtful about the vision and the values, the mission that we're on as a combined organization, and that ultimately we're delivering the value that we say, but doing it in a way that puts people first, that puts the society first. I mean, we have both organizations play a huge role in the ESG space, and we're really making sure that drives how we engage our people and drives how we engage the market.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important. You hit the nail on the head, especially when you're talking about mission and ESG and this kind of ginormous change that's happening that might only happen once in someone's career. You mentioned the term kind of people first strategy. I can imagine kind of what you mean by that, but could you define what that actually looks like in practice and maybe provide an example as well?
Yeah, sure. We use people first a lot, and I think it's a fairly common, or more becoming a more common frame in
Yeah.
the market nowadays. We literally, and we were working on some things in our integration work, and literally for us it means putting people first before anything else, and that feels clear, but we had been working on some documentation, and people first was second, and immediately the leader said, nope, that goes to the top of the list. And I think that really is how we think about it. So we may make operational decisions, financial decisions, technological or strategic decisions to, for our business success. But ultimately, if we're people first, that means we're thinking about the vision, the mission, how we support our people, what they're getting out of the work
Yeah.
as the primary objective. And so I think an example, and again, like a lot of folks are doing this in the return to office space, but our people first philosophy really drove it. It started from, we continuously iterated in a very agile way our people practices, our people philosophy. So whether it was benefits, whether it was rewards, it, we started giving people a stipend to spend on office furniture in their home.
Mhm.
We really have been thoughtful and pragmatic about sending people back or bringing people back to the office, but we've done it in a way that says, there's no forced time frame. We are going to make the office a destination and have a real rationale for why people use it. What's the purpose? What is the betterment of it? And making sure that we are agile enough in its use and improve processes where we're not in the office, because it's ultimately about people benefiting from their work. And if people benefit and people have a great experience, we know we're going to get the value we need to deliver business outcomes. And so that's really, I think, a easy approach to a really complex problem, but it really it's like a first principle. I think a lot of folks talk about that. That's our first principle, and it drives every decision we make.
Yeah, people are oftentimes the most valuable asset of an organization. They are at the front line of your companies. They're making decisions, talking to customers, and they're in it day to day as well. And I've heard a lot of people ops teams talking about how their employees are their customers of the company as well. So having them put first really makes a lot of sense, and it's exciting to see a lot of companies do that as well. And I want to talk about, culture conduits and people managers specifically when we're talking about, I think one of the things you mentioned 2020, definitely not a normal year, and 2021, as we go into 2022, a lot of folks are talking about, practicing empathy, practicing vulnerability. What does that look like in practice? Do you think it's possible to teach people managers to be more empathetic and to really practice this skill? And if you do, how do you actually do that?
Yeah, it's absolutely a behavior that can be changed or a skill that can be developed. My view on it is that you can't just hope it happens. You have to really focus on that developmentally. I think you need to do it from an organization perspective. And so for me, it really starts with education. What is empathy? I think, people might be, talk about vulnerability, empathy. People might say, oh, you just go read a Brene Brown book or something along those lines. But in actuality, there's so much more to it, and we can learn really what it is, and what it is, why we do it, what it means to folks, and then take a step back after there's been some learning, assess folks, or maybe at the same time assess folks to see where they are, and then really start working with people. How do they do the work? So what's the system that people leaders have in place to enable them to be more empathetic and more vulnerable? I think that's absolutely critical. The tools and shared experiences that people use will reinforce that empathy as a key behavior. And then lastly, I think it's really about coaching. People leaders are employees too, be it their people leader, be
Right.
it a coach that is on the side. There are platforms that make that available, right? So if we're trying to figure out, we at S&P have career coaches, but making sure someone can really help them, and that there's a psychological safety that's been developed
Yeah.
through all of this, so that folks understand what it means to be vulnerable, how they show empathy, and that it's okay. And we have different folks from different generations. We need to really meet them where they are and bring them along on a journey. But I think everybody can learn to be empathetic, and people leaders, people managers, they have to be, they're the ones with the biggest sphere of influence in an organization.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned was that intentionality piece. As much as you will it to happen, or you paint it on the real kitchen wall, or you put it virtually up as well, it doesn't just happen. You need to have some strategy behind it. You need to give people resources. Coaching is important as well. And I want to talk about kind of the second piece you mentioned too, in terms of following up and making sure you're asking for feedback, you're creating that psychological safety, empathy. These are kind of intangible things to measure, but a lot of companies, especially right now, as they're thinking about retaining and attracting talent, want to know how their organizational health is. How do you think about measuring the organizational health at, your organization, and what does that really look like?
Yeah, it's a really big question, because when I think it's a really big question for an individual to really think through. So it starts to, like, what is organizational? What is your individual health? What does that actually mean? Is it fitness? Is it wellness? Is it well-being? There's a lot of concepts from an organization. I think that's the same thing. What are the most general concepts that organizational health looks like? That you're achieving your business goals, that you don't lose people too quickly, you can hire people properly, that you generally are a sustaining company. But then it gets to, I think, a real clear question is, what do you want to achieve? What's your goal or outcome? Because in that light, an organizational health shifts dramatically. And so I'll just keep carrying this analogy. But if I'm an individual and I want to understand my health, great. Do I need to lose weight? Does my health drive me to be a better athlete? To be someone, to be kicking butt in my older age? Do I want to be a weightlifter or a sprinter? Right? There's a lot of, what are your outcomes? And in the business sense, are we trying to innovate? Are we trying to sustain our first mover advantage? Whatever those situations are. And then ultimately the data that you monitor will mirror that. So if we take an analogy, we're a startup company and we're in high growth, but we really want to innovate. I'm going to be looking at the layering of my organization. I'm going to be looking at, do we delegate authority properly, right? Because if we want to move quickly and innovate, are we agile and developing a test and learn environment, right? So is there trust? Is there empathy? Is there vulnerability? Are people comfortable in that environment? And do people have safety to raise up concerns? Because if we're trying to innovate, if that's the skill, the organizational health skill, well, we have to have psychological safety to accomplish that, because every voice just compounds good stuff or bad stuff. Mm-hmm. And if we don't hear that, I think that's tantamount to failure. You're not healthy if you're not getting that.
Absolutely. It's not exactly quote unquote healthy if you're just getting positive feedback or no feedback at all, or if nothing, nobody has anything constructive to say. I was just reading an article about the constructs of a nice company culture. Nice isn't exactly productive or innovative. You want to promote healthy discourse and disagreement and, that innovation as well, if that is your goal too. I definitely like the analogy, because sometimes talking about these big concepts, it's hard to boil down, but you can really set those goals, have a foundation, and kind of ask your team where they are today too. I want to ask about that employee feedback management and listening. How do you see, employee feedback as an important tool to build that culture of listening, and how is that manifesting at the organization right now?
So, employee listening is fascinating. There's so many ways to look at it, and I think everybody starts with, you do an employee survey. That's fairly generic, but to me, there's listening in so many other forms, and I won't exhaust what a lot of other folks say, but there's someone that I follow a lot in the HR space, David Green. I think he was saying this on his podcast, something around data is just a deeper form of listening, and being able to derive as many insights as possible from your people, be it active or passive, right, that really help understand what's going on. So we just talked about organizational health. If you have a healthy organization, people are going to share. But if you have a healthy organization, people understand that you're trying to listen as much as possible. And if there's a trust in that, then they're going to say, hey, great. Like if you use some sort of platform like Microsoft Analytics or something like that, awesome. Please gather that. Or if people say, I want to wear a Whoop or I want to wear a Fitbit, and that might help you understand how things are going. But then there's also platforms like AllVoices that also can bring that forward. And so I think really, at its core is listening through every mechanism possible, so that people can be making data-driven decisions.
Absolutely. You have that data-driven decision. Once you have that trust, as you mentioned, that's a big word to build up with employees. You have that feedback. But the next piece of it is actually listening and showing that you're actively listening, making some changes, or at least communicating that you heard employees as well. Because the odds are, if you don't communicate that, or somebody brings something up or they share something and nothing is done about it, the odds of them sharing that same thing again in the future are pretty low. Can you provide an example of a strategy that has changed or been implemented because of employee feedback, whether that's passive, active, whatever mechanism was used?
Yeah, I'm going to go back in time a little bit for me, and this is probably as employee survey companies were standing up and really solidifying themselves in the space. And I was at an organization, Fannie Mae, for a long period of time, and then we were doing the surveys ourselves with our internal communication team, and we were running all the numbers, and we learned an awful lot. But I think we made a big pivot to say, hey, you can listen, but if you're not transparent about it, right, the employees will not give you that opportunity again. And so we made a very strong focus on ensuring that they understood that we were listening to their feedback. Ultimately, we used a platform to make sure that they felt they could trust that we'd always get a question of, oh, someone's really knows it's me providing that feedback. And so we ultimately chose to go with a vendor to provide that autonomy or anonymity, excuse me. But we really hit hard on, if they're going to give us feedback, what are the top one or two things, and hammer that for the year. And one year that we were getting all sorts of intermittent feedback around, oh, we could solve this problem here, or I saw this solution and no one went for it. And we literally came up with this idea of a innovation or continuous improvement program that ultimately you could propose any solution, right? So we heard it in the feedback, and we built a platform with an external party that you put in ideas, how much improvement you think it could make, give a little guess ROI on that improvement. And ultimately the company saved tens of millions of dollars over a multiple year period of time. And it was because this was the number one comment we saw, an opportunity where it gives them the voice. And it gives them the voice again because we gave them another mechanism to provide their insight. And then that group, or maybe an individual, if they did raise their hand verbally, could go solve it. And I mean, they were all bottoms up ideas to go save millions upon millions of dollars that we could reinvest in doing more things for the mission of the organization. That really, I think, kicked us up a notch in terms of engagement, alignment, just a better experience for our employees.
Ideas come from anywhere, and it can really impact the bottom line of the business, impact the mission of the business, and really improve processes. I think sometimes people are afraid of feedback, or it's always going to be negative or constructive, but there's also positive feedback, there's iterative feedback, there's all different kinds, and you have to open the doorways for all of them to really see the impact that it's going to have. I want to ask a little bit, you mentioned your experience at, Fannie Mae, but also, you have experience in the field at a variety of companies and in different roles. So not necessarily at S&P Global right now, but what are some common mistakes you're seeing companies make in their people strategy, today?
Yeah, and I don't think this is indicative of my current employer or my past employers. Yes. But I think in general, HR organizations are at a bit of a nexus point in terms of data. HR platforms, HR tools are growing everywhere. I mean, AllVoices obviously one of them that I think has a very compelling use case. How organizations gather and use that data is critical. People analytics functions are growing. The opportunities to play them. I spoke about, fitness wearables, survey platforms.
Yeah.
All of these things can really help organizations. And the curious, digitally led organizations that democratize voices and access, I think are ultimately winning in terms of those people outcomes. So it feels like the hard data and truths drive better, qualitative or soft experiences, which I fundamentally disagree with that concept, but that's what I think people kind of struggle with, is you got to go with gut if you're in the HR space, and more organizations are moving in this direction. And so really making sure that your ecosystem for people, the people function, hydrates the system with data, uses platforms to democratize voice, and that you're learning from your people, or the people in your stakeholders in your realm, ultimately will I think improve the people strategy dramatically. Because if we're going off of someone's past experience or gut feel, we're guessing, and people functions should not be in that space. And frankly, I think leaders expect the HR space to step up and do that more, especially since we've built up a lot of credibility in the last 2 years in terms of how we have approached some of these really complex, challenging situations. And how do you handle a workplace in a pandemic? How do you handle folks, working from home and coming, moving back into an office or not? So using that credibility kind of also allows us to maybe go ask for more of those resources, to do better listening, to use more data to drive decisions.
Yeah, it's very cyclical. I like the phrase you mentioned in terms of HR tech stack or system should hydrate the ecosystem as well. You don't need to reinvent the wheel too when you're talking about making educated guesses based on past experiences or assuming what people want to need as well. I think that goes back to your earlier example of when you were talking about your return to office plans and making sure you're checking in with employees, a people first approach. If you are saying that you do have a people first strategy, are you asking your people what they need and want in that feedback? Are you showing that, you trust your people as well? So all of these questions and all of these different ways that you can go with this as well. I guess a different way of asking too is, what is something that, people leaders must have or need to incorporate in their strategy in order to be successful in the future, in addition to, making sure that they are doing their research on these platforms and also, thinking about things from a systemic lens?
Yeah. Well, since I'm with you, and I mean, I have to say a listening capability, but I fundamentally no, but I'm going to, because I really believe it's the right thing. And it can be super basic. I mean, I have been trained up a little bit on lean management and agile management protocols, and some of the things that we talk about are simply the voice of the customer. And literally, you can just go and talk to someone, right? You could do a Gemba walk and walk around the floor and gather insights. That's a great mechanism. But if you can use, like we were just talking about, having more data, hydrate your systems with that insight, having digital platforms, I think that's really critical, because people leaders, most people aren't the best listeners themselves. Generally in society, maybe I'm making some huge meta comment here, but I think people listening is a capability or skill that needs to be developed. So people leaders have to develop that, and maybe it is through systems, right? We talked about that. Maybe it's through tools like AllVoices, but also just growing that mindset of being vulnerable, being comfortable that if you're listening, you're going to get feedback, and that you can do something with that is really important. And maybe you need a coach to go through that journey. But I think it's an absolute must-have for people leaders to be doing that. Because the other thing on people leaders incorporating this strategy to be successful is, people leaders, it's a role that you come into, but maybe you weren't necessarily born for it, or maybe you were put there because you were a great individual contributor, and we needed to promote you, and that's a historical norm. So people leadership is a continual journey. It's a growth journey. And if listening is the number one capability that I think you have to have in order to develop all those other skills to make sure your team's doing the right work, that you're improving your work-life balance in your career. So that would be my must-have.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. And to your point, I always say I never think that there are born people managers. I think there are born visionaries, people who are naturally good at things, but it is a skill that you have to build up and continually foster and cultivate in terms of active listening, because that goes towards trust, psychological safety, creating meaningful connections on an individual level. And the reality is that if you as an organization or a company isn't actively listening, people are talking regardless. So you might want to hear what they have to say, whether it's their manager, their friends on the internet. I was in employer branding. We all know Glassdoor and all of the social media, where it's happening. So making sure that you're building that trust with employees, actively listening, and training up your people managers via coaching and other resources is really important. Is there anything I didn't ask you, Alan, that you want to share with our audience, or maybe 1 to 2 key insights you hope listeners bring with them after tuning into our conversation here this afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, I'll hammer this home, but I think making sure that you're gathering insights that are data driven are going to unearth an awful lot. And I also think part of listening that is important to me, and I think important to organizations that get this, is that you've got to go out and work for it. You've got to build the trust, right? So people first as a philosophy is something that takes time. You don't get it because you do some initiative. You get it through a series of actions over a long period of time, at times that are super challenging. But that you're also actively going out and doing that in a data-driven format, right? So
Absolutely.
Org network analysis is something I'm super passionate about, and I want to do a lot more of that in the future. And that to me is going and talking to folks and saying, who else is doing something that either good, they're a change agent, they get stuff done, understanding kind of the hidden systems that live within our organizations is as important as actually just listening. Because if I think about organizational health, if there's something wrong, I need to do diagnostics. So back to that individual health analogy, I need to do diagnostics to understand, do I have some problem in my knee that's hurting my back? And that's why I can't lose the weight I need to lose. You're not going to see that maybe just generally walking around. So you need to have someone special help you with that. I think that's really important. So it's proactive, and it's really using the tools around you to go actively listen, maybe even more than you thought was necessary.
I think that proactivity piece is a common thread throughout our conversation, whether that's, your people first strategy, active listening, making sure you're thinking about what people want and need, and you're not making those guesses, you're actually asking them as well, and continually building that trust. And I also like that kind of discovering the hidden systems and having those one-on-one conversations. It's not just a one and done strategy, a one conversation, it's two-way, and you have to make sure that you have a plan in action there.
Definitely.
Alan, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I enjoyed our conversation this afternoon.
I did too. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited about it.
Absolutely. As a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management and think it's a requirement for the company to succeed as a whole. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.